Darius Shadow Kane, 17 years old. A shadow is all he seemed to be, slipping through the crowded city streets unseen. Most people never even noticed him, but those who did quickly learned to hold their wallets a little tighter. Shadow was a hustler, a street magician who could make your cash disappear with a flick of his wrist. Shadow wasn't born with a deck of cards up his sleeve. He was born into a world where survival was the only game in town, and he was determined to play it better than anyone else. The streets were his classroom, and they had taught him one harsh lesson after another. He knew every back alley, every shortcut, every hidden corner where trouble lurked. He could smell trouble coming like a storm on the wind, and he knew how to disappear before it broke. Shadow wasn't just his nickname, it was his way of life. Life hadn't been kind to Shadow. He'd grown up tough, raised in a neighborhood where the concrete was cracked and the dreams were even more broken. He'd seen more than his share of hardship, more pain and struggle than anyone that young should ever have to witness. His childhood home had been a cramped two-bedroom apartment with more leaks than a sinking ship. He shared it with his mom, a woman who worked 2 jobs and still struggled to make ends meet. His father? Shadow barely remembered the man. He'd left when Shadow was just a kid, another casualty of the streets they called home. Growing up, Shadow had learned that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. The only people who looked out for you were the ones who bled with you, and even then, you had to watch your back. Shadow had a gift, a knack for making things disappear. He was a master pickpocket, his fingers moving with the speed and precision of a surgeon. Wallets seemed to jump into his hands, watches vanished from wrists with a gentle tug, and necklaces found new homes without their owners ever being the wiser. But Shadow was more than just a thief. He was a con artist, a weaver of illusions who could charm the money right out of your pocket. He had a story for every mark, a sob story that would make their heartstrings sing and their wallets weep. He knew how to read people, how to spot the ones who were vulnerable, the ones who were easily swayed by a sob story and a charming smile. He could become anyone they needed him to be, a lost soul down on his luck, or a friendly face in a crowd. Behind Shadow's cool exterior and cynical facade was a young man hardened by the streets. He'd seen the worst of humanity, the greed, the desperation, the willingness to step on anyone to get ahead. It was hard to trust anyone when everyone seemed to have an angle, a hidden motive. He'd been betrayed before, his loyalty repaid with a knife in the back. It had taught him a valuable lesson, one he wouldn't soon forget. Trust no one, especially not in this concrete jungle they called a city. He kept his guard up, his emotions locked away behind a wall of indifference. He couldn't afford to let anyone get too close, couldn't risk the pain of another betrayal. So he wore his cynicism like armor, a shield to protect his heart from further damage.